Alright, hello and welcome to round 6 of the BlitzFuel Invitational 2025. As we saw in the first 5 videos, I was entering this round with an even score. For a bit of a roller coaster and kind of disappointing sequence of results. I mean, there were several games that definitely could have gone either way. I probably should have lost in round 4 to Grandmaster Cordova. I arguably could have even lost in round 3 to International Master Ostrovsky and probably should have drawn. So I definitely got some, quote-unquote undeserved points, but I felt that I left more points on the table than I had been granted after spoiling what was an objectively winning position in round 5 against Grandmaster Kevlishvili, and sort of unnecessarily experimenting in round 1 in the opening and getting a little bit punished. So going into this game, I was pretty disappointed with my performance thus far. At this point, it was pretty clear that I was not making a norm. And so I was just trying to sort of stabilize and at least end up having an acceptable event. But my opponent was struggling even more than I was at this point. Through 5 rounds, he had lost all 5 of his games, which is very rare, obviously, in a round robin. But that, in a way, makes him the most dangerous opponent in the field, because my opponent is a very young international master, Elon Schneider. I think he's, 12 or 13, 14 years old, very, very, very young. And a player like that, of that caliber, somebody who's very, very strong, very, very young, takes sort of every game by game, because, again, they're very, very young. Tournaments sort of don't really matter. Like, they're just sort of demarcations of sets of 9 games. Like, it's basically one long tournament. They're probably not going to go 0 out of 9. Like, that's just not a thing that's going to happen. And so he's going to pick up a point or two by the end of the tournament, and you definitely don't want that to be you. But at the same time, when your opponent is clearly out of form and struggling, you do have to try to take advantage. And so even with the whack pieces, and even knowing that I was also a little bit out of form, given especially the previous game, I really wasn't playing super well, this was definitely a game that I was going to try to play for a win. Cautiously, I wouldn't be, super disappointed if we drew the game, but certainly wanted to keep the game alive, at least, and get like a big strategic fight, which is partially why I decided to go for the Caro-Kann. Obviously, we had success with it in round 2, winning with black against Grandmaster Ferrero, which was a good start to the opening. And the Caro was also just the opening that I had mostly intended to play for this tournament going in, unless the situation called for something else, or there was like a specific preparation that I wanted to try against a particular opponent. But in this game, I saw no reason to deviate from the Caro, especially given the situation where I wanted to generate some kind of winning chances. The Caro is a very good way to keep pieces on the board, generate an imbalance right out of the opening, and hope to outplay your opponent. My opponent went for the 2 knights variation, which I did expect. He had, I think he had a game or 2 in this line. Not a lot of games in general, which often happens with these young players. They haven't been, alive long enough to to have a lot of games in the database. But I think I remember seeing a game or 2 in the 2 knights. I wasn't quite sure exactly what variation of it we would see, because after bishop g4, which is the main line, h3 takes, and e6, white has a fairly wide choice of how to continue. I think the most common is to move d4, trying to cement control of the center a little bit. Black generally takes on e4. You don't strictly have to. Knight f6 is kind of playable as well. But I think black usually takes on e4. And now after queen takes e4, knight f6, queen goes back to d3 to maintain defense of the d4 pawn. And now black has a few ways to play, but just completing the development with bishop e7, bishop e2, castle, and knight b7 is very solid. Very difficult for white to generate any real advantage. And black has ideas of how to continue. b5 is a very classical one, trying to cement control of the d5 square. And a lot of times you almost play it like this is an isolated queen's pawn, even though it's not yet. There are lines where it could become one, and even if it doesn't, a lot of the principles are the same in terms of how black should play against it. So I was reasonably happy to go for that. D3 is another alternative that opponents sometimes play, aimed at being able to recapture on e4 with the pawn and not having the pawn on d4 be a quote-unquote weakness. And basically arguing that white doesn't need to control the center all that much because black isn't really going to challenge it either. One of the downsides is it allows black to develop with knight f6 very comfortably. Now e5 is not very serious because white would lose a move if he ever played d4 and tried to set up like the French type structure. So after bishop e2, knight d7, castle, bishop to c5, we'd reach something similar to the game, but black has a very, very solid position. And so the third option which my opponent played is to just complete the development very quickly with the move bishop to e2, intending to castle and defer the decision of what to do with the d-pawn later, perhaps even fade shadowing the bishop in some lines. But the downside is black gets to develop very rapidly and very naturally with the bishop coming to c5, taking control of the d4 square. So after castle, the knight goes to e7. Unlike game 2 where we were talking about the knight doesn't really belong in e7, but we'll put it there anyway, even though it's a concession, because it was stopping some problems on the e-file. In this type of position, the knight is actually very well placed on e7, and in particular going to g6, because with the knight on f6 we run into some e5 ideas eventually, setting up a potentially unpleasant French structure and putting the question to where these knights are going to go, because they'll both want to go to d7. But on g6 we take very firm control of the e5 square. We leave sort of this pathway available for the second knight, and with the queen on f3 the knight can harass it from h4 or from e5, or even go to f4 sometimes in some lines and just put the question to the queen, sort of being in the way of general defenses that white would like to make. So then e7 is very well placed. My opponent played the best move, still well within theory, of knight a4. Looks a bit strange to put the knight on the rim just to attack the bishop once, but the idea is to force the bishop away from the d4 square so that white can put the pawn there. Bishop d6. Technically bishop d4 is possible, but after c3 white will get a pawn to d4 anyway, and even though that leaves the knight a little bit stranded and not able to come back, the loss of time is more than enough to compensate for the awkward position of the knight, which can still re-enter the game through c5 and even b2 maybe if b4 or something is played. So we just drop back to d6, and now after d4 this is generally black's signal to go ahead and take this pawn, otherwise white will play e5. After takes, we reach a very, very solid position for black still, but sort of something very similar to the d4 lines of the two knights. In this position I played a very topical idea in this line, which is after knight d7, rook d1 to play the move queen to a5, intending, as we'll see, after b3. Knight to c3 is definitely the main move, but b3 is also quite reasonable. Knight f6, queen f3 to transfer the queen over to f5 and try to force an exchange of queens. In general, if black manages to get the queens off, then he's very happy. White's advantage of the two bishops and the space advantage is much more pronounced when there are queens on the board and there's hope of generating an attack. Without the queens, black inches closer to an endgame where this d4 pawn can definitely become a weakness, and the less space you have, sort of the fewer pieces you want on the board is a good general maxim, because it's just more difficult to control like a very large space with fewer pieces. So my opponent played c4, which is a very natural follow-up to b3, just staking more claim in the center. And here I sort of revealed the other point of queen a5, which is to be able to castle queenside rather than kingside. Castling queenside has a few advantages. One is it puts the rook on the d-file immediately, so we generate some immediate pressure on the d-pawn. And we're also prepared to start advancing on the kingside with our pawns, try to generate some serious play there. The downside, of course, is that we can fall under a serious attack on the queenside because we have no defenders, basically, and white is already very well placed to start a pawn storm of his own. And so I thought during the game that white should give very, very serious consideration to trying to keep the queens on the board with a move like queen to c3. The queen is kind of awkwardly placed here, doesn't really want to be on c3. It's vulnerable to attack from e4. There's sort of tactics with queen takes f2 that white needs to worry about in some lines if this knight ever moves. The queen on c3 also doesn't really provide much support to the pawn storm. It would kind of rather be on, like, you know, even like, well, I don't know. I mean, there aren't really that many great squares for it either. c3 is not that bad. But it does keep the queens on the board, which lends sort of more credence to the idea that white can go for a sort of gung-ho attack on the queen side and just sort of play for the race. I would probably have played the move knight to g6, and then after a move like b4, knight e4, queen, let's say e3, we can harass the queen quite a bit and start a pawn storm of our own, and white's attack is coming, but it's not really clear who's supposed to be first. So ultimately my opponent decided to allow the exchange of queens, which I wasn't really quite sure. I mean, it makes sense because the queen's being on the board. If his queen is just going to get harassed anyway, and all of my attack is coming with tempo, then there's no reason to keep them on. But here I played the move h5, starting to grab some space on the king side. And my opponent exchanged the queens, then played bishop to d3, making the very serious threat, really, of disrupting black's pawn structure. So for example, if I was to continue, for example, with h4, now after d5, it's already very, very unpleasant for black. This is a very, very serious threat, because if I go ahead and take on d5, then the pawn structure becomes completely decimated, and white is clearly doing very, very, very well, maybe even has an objectively winning advantage already. There's simply no play on the king side anymore. There aren't enough pieces to generate any sort of attack, and these triple pawns are very likely to just drop off very, very quickly. So after a while, I decided that this threat was just simply too annoying. I mean, I could play bishop e7, just sort of preempt the idea of d5 by defending the knight with the bishop. But after bishop e7, I mean, even after takes and d5, even without sort of destroying the structure, I thought that this would be very, very comfortable for white, with some serious difficulty mobilizing the king side for black. And in the meantime, white's queen side play is quite significant. After cd, for example, rook c1 is already very unpleasant. So eventually I decided to just drop the knight back. The knight is not terribly placed on e7. I mean, again, the knight going to g6 and then maybe to f4 is always an idea for black, so I wasn't too upset about having to drop back. It also controls the d5 square, so these pawn sacrifices are much less serious. My opponent played a3, very logical, trying to get his pawn side, queenside pawn storm started. I played h4, again grabbing more space and intending my next idea, which I played, of bringing the knight to f4. The rook can also slide in via h5 to try to indirectly join the quote-unquote defense, the sort of just counterplay in general. For example, rook h5 and then e5 is like a way to try to generate some play. He played b4, knight h5, very consistent. He played a strange move, rook d1. I didn't really understand. It's not a bad move. There's not really anything wrong with it. But I was expecting a move like bishop to e2, intending to bring the bishop to f3. Maybe a move like king f1, just trying to get out of the way of some of the problems on the king side. Just dropping the bishop back here. Maybe even a move like b5. I didn't think it would be good, but trying to open some lines on the queen side. A move like knight c3, but rook e1 is also perfectly fine. So I played knight f4, and now he played the move bishop e4, intending to bring the bishop back to f3. I played the move rook to g8, getting off the long diagonal and intending to play g5. I think in hindsight, it was probably slightly better to play the move rook to h6, which is a little bit of a mysterious-looking move at first glance. But the point of it is that it protects the e6 pawn in some lines, so if white sort of continues lackadaisically with like a random move like rook c1, now we're able to play f5. The bishop can't come back to f3 because of knight d3, so it comes back to b1. And now this rook is able to slide into g6 and generate some very, very serious problems for white, who simply can't defend this pawn. So more likely white would preempt this with, for example, I don't know, rook to d1 maybe, defending d3. But now after f5, bishop f3, g5, black isn't going to have a lot of the same problems that we'll see in the game, where this e6 pawn becomes a very serious problem. And now black's plan is very straightforward. Rook g8, g4, blow open the king side and generate some very big threats. But I played rook g8, which I thought, made sense. g5, g4 is the very clear plan. My opponent found a nice solution, though, in knight c3, bringing the knight back into the game, and after g5, knight e2. Now I spent a lot of my remaining time because I was trying to find a way really to keep the game going. There's a lot of ways that this can just fizzle out completely. For example, if I exchange the knights and then play knight to g6, trying to bring the other knight to f4, then after d5, knight f4, rook somewhere, maybe back to e1. Takes. Bishop f6 is a very important detail. And then after like checks, rook c7, rook d1, white will recover his pawn, and black is never going to win this position. But I probably won't lose either. I can plant the bishop on f4, and it's very, very powerful and very difficult to dislodge. But I thought that there were many ways like this where white can sort of liquidate into a risk-free position. So of course the main move I was considering was bringing the other knight to g6, lending some support to the knight on f5. But once again, I had some sort of serious reservations about d5, and we could potentially just reach the same position. If I went ahead and took with the e-pawn, then bishop h7 is very unpleasant. This rook really has not many places to go, with the king side collapsing now. So I didn't really feel like any of this was leading to any serious winning attempt. And if I played f5, which was the move that I wanted to play, now, yes, the bishop can't come back to f3 because of knight d3, but after the bishop just slides back to c2, it's not really clear how black should continue. Unlike with the rook being on h6 and holding the e6 pawn, we don't have time for g4, because white will simply take twice. And then even rook takes e6 here is already unpleasant, but taking first makes a lot more sense. Black takes with the rook takes e6. Black is not in time to generate any real threats against the king. If the rook g8, white can simply get away with taking the piece, and the king easily escapes. So eventually I settled on what really isn't a very good move in this knight back to g6, knight f back to g6, which does at least keep the pieces on the board, and there's no immediate way for white to liquidate into sort of a draw. But at the same time, black is not really achieving anything. It's not really clear what black's plan is, because I will never be able to play f5 for similar reasons. The e6 pawn will simply become too weak. And if I'm not playing f5, then the rook on g8 no longer makes sense, these pawns no longer make sense. I still have to worry about d5 and bishop f6 in a lot of lines. Even d5 here, for example, can be considered. After takes, just bishop back, and it's not that easy to hold this construction. I don't think there's any reason for white to do this, but it's something that could be played. My opponent instead played the move bishop to c2, which sort of gets out of the way of f5, so it makes a little bit of sense. Wasn't really necessary, but a perfectly fine move. And here I started to realize that I'm kind of out of ideas on the king side, and so I need to sort of switch gears. What I probably should have done was just played the move b5 immediately, and this is what I spent most of my time calculating. But I was afraid that after takes bishop d3, a6, a4 that I just wasn't prepared for the opening of the queen side. As it turns out, the computer suggests just taking, allowing the check, and playing the very cold-blooded king b7, intending to meet a takes b5 with a5, keeping the whole queen side shut down and maintaining the d5 square for the knight. This, I think, would offer black some real chances at keeping the game going. Objectively, it's about equal, but white can get into trouble if he's not super careful here, and we are both very low on time at this point. So I probably should have gone for that, but I wanted to improve on this idea. So I played a very strange move, bishop to c7. Again, intending b5, but trying to lend a little bit more support to the queen side first. My opponent played rook a to d1, which made sense. I played a6, preparing b5. But the downside of bishop c7 is I'm no longer putting any pressure on b4, so white can very comfortably play the move a4. I tried to go back, but after bishop c3, king b8, rook b1, I started to realize that I could start getting myself into very serious trouble here. If I allow white to play the move b5, then black is under serious danger of falling under a very real attack on the queen side. It's very difficult for black to organize any kind of defense. And so at this point, I think black is basically forced to play b5, even though it's very difficult to support that pawn, which I played. We exchanged several times. Bishop d3 was played, going after the pawn, which cannot be defended, so this is a true pawn sacrifice. I played the move knight to d5. Bishop d2 was played. I played knight to f4, which is slightly inaccurate. The computer suggests g4, which is a sort of surprising move, but a bit of an easier way to liquidate to a draw. Because at this point, the threat on g4 is very, very serious and forces white to basically take twice. At which point, white is up a pawn, but the opposite color bishop should make it a very, very, very comfortable hold. But I missed this idea and I played knight f4 first, which could have gotten me into a little bit of trouble. He took on b5. I took on e2, which, again, a little bit sloppy. I had a very specific idea in mind with it that ended up working okay, but more accurate would have been, for example, to play king b7, going to b6, or rook c8, taking control of the open file, and basically acknowledging that black is obligated to play down a pawn at this point. But I ended up taking on e2. The bishop took. I played bishop f4. This is the intent of taking on e2. I was trying to vacate this square for the bishop. And the idea at this point was that after takes, which was played, bishop f3 takes on d4. White still has some advantage because of the passed b-pawn, but black should be able to hold this somewhat comfortably with careful play. After bishop f4, white probably should have not acquiesced to the immediate exchange and instead played a move like rook b2, intending to exchange the bishops but on white's terms. The pawn is untouchable due to the pin. So now after, for example, king c7, now we really are threatening the pawn, b5, and king to d6. White has retained his extra pawn in a not very powerful b-pawn because it is currently stuck and it's not that easy to punch through. But a very, very healthy extra pawn for sure. And so even though black probably should hold this position, it would be a fairly long defensive task ahead, even with white having low time. And in practice, I think white has excellent winning chances. But he did elect to exchange the bishops, fortunately, and after takes, rook takes d4, b5, knight to d5 interfering with this diagonal, so that there's no rook a1 to a8 ideas. White played rook e5, which definitely makes my job easier. I was definitely expecting to move b6, and then after king b7, now at least the knight and the king are pretty frozen. So now, for example, rook e5 is really quite serious. Black is very tied down. None of his pieces can really move. And so I don't really have anything I can do other than sit. And then worst case, I mean, white can most likely achieve a a 4 versus 3 type, or this, a 4 versus 3 type situation, or, well, I guess that's a 3 versus 3 type situation, so maybe not that, but, well, I guess even this is fine then. Yeah, still not that easy for white to find an idea. I mean, I guess white would activate his king, and it would still be very uncomfortable for black, because I'm pretty much just sitting and waiting for white to find an idea, and just hoping that there isn't one. But there might not be one. This might be nothing as well. But in any case, my opponent played rook e5, which makes my job a little bit easier. I played king c7. Now b6 was played, but instead of king b7, which would transpose basically into those lines, I get to play the move king d6, putting immediate pressure on the rook. White does have the option of taking and playing b7, using the fact that his pawn is very strong. But after the exchanges, black is doing just fine. In fact, it's probably even a little bit easier for black to play, because this pawn is really restricting white's king side, and it is very, very difficult to attack being on a dark square. So instead, my opponent simply dropped back, played rook b8, b7. Now, I played rook c4, which was good enough. Rook b4 was definitely simpler, forcing off one pair of rooks. Now, after takes, rook b1, the knight can simply come back, and then we'll play king c7 and collect the pawn with a very, very comfortable draw. But rook c4 was okay. My opponent played rook b3, intending to exchange, intending to double the rooks. Now rook b4 is not possible because of bishop takes d5. So I have to drop back to c7, put pressure on this pawn. He went ahead and defended. I played f5. It's not really necessary. Probably it's simpler to just play king c6 and force white to start making a bunch of checks. But f5 is also fine. And after rook b5, rook c5, trying to exchange rooks, he went back. And at this point, we simply repeated moves. I think white still has, the computer still gives white an objective advantage, which I'm not sure why, because it doesn't really suggest a plan. It pretty much just shuffles aimlessly for a while. But I thought that white could still try a little bit. For example, with the move g3, if black goes ahead and takes, then white has the opportunity to make a passed h-pawn. It is a little double-edged because it gives black the opportunity to make a passed e-pawn as well, and I wasn't quite sure, who was supposed to be faster here. So I don't blame my opponent on load time for, just bailing out and not really finding out. But there are other ways that white can improve his position first too. For example, he could try to slide his king in a little bit more, because black is basically just passing. If I ever play e5, then this exchange is potentially a little bit unpleasant for black. I mean, obviously it's still well within the drawing margin, but I felt that this was at least annoying, because we'd probably end up in maybe a 3v2 situation, or like a situation where it's 3v3, but some of the pawns are very awkwardly positioned. For example, here the computer suggests g4, which already is not, particularly intuitive. White can, for example, go for something like this, and black is comfortably holding, but white is up a pawn. There's still some chances to win the game here. So I was definitely happy that my opponent just repeated here. I thought that he would continue playing on for a little bit, and I wasn't quite sure what I would do. I mean, most likely I would just shuffle this rook back and forth forever, never really play e5 myself. For example, after rook c7, king f1, might still play rook c5, and just wait for him to come up with an idea. Rook c7, king d2, just continue with rook c5. And eventually white would have to try for something like g3, but again, this starts to look scary with the e-pawn marching down the board. So overall, I mean, overall it was actually a relatively stable game. The evaluation never really moved. You can sort of chalk this up to a reasonably well-played draw for both sides, which was disappointing because I really did feel like I was getting some very serious chances around when I got knight h5, knight f4 in. I thought at this point, my plan was very, very clear, and I had very good chances of scoring a victory. But my opponent played well to sort of diffuse any pressure on the king side, and even generate some winning chances of his own. I mean, this definitely could have gone this definitely could have gone south if I didn't bail out in the way that I did, or my opponent, you know, found some slightly better technical moves where he could generate, I think, some very, very serious winning chances in the pawn up endgame. So, in some sense, fortunate to hold. I definitely couldn't be too upset with the result. I mean, drawing with black is very, very difficult to be disappointed in. But it maintained my even score with 3 rounds to go, officially eliminating myself from Roar contention, even as unrealistic as it would have been going into this round. But I still needed to prepare for the second game of the day, which I, you know, going in sort of expected to be the main focus of the day anyway. Generally, having the white pieces are the games you're going to try, so just try. This wasn't a particularly long game. Tried to regroup a little bit and finish out the last third of the tournament strong. Come up with at least an acceptable score. So I will see you all next time for round 7. Thank you for watching, and if you have any feedback on these videos, let me know.